while we're on the topic of DKA, I've always wondered, so when you have a patient who is in DKA and their sodium looks super low on the labs because you have this high osmotic pressure inside the vascular system, it's pulling in all that water from the interstitial space, it dilutes out the sodium. I always wonder, like, do I need to correct my sodium, which typically, what is it? It's like 2 for every 100 milligrams per deciliter.
You're talking about the glucose correction for sodium, for diluted sodium.
Yeah, I want to say
had an assistant. I would ask them to look it up right now because I can't remember what it is. I don't remember what it is off the top of my head, but I know that MD Calc has an excellent corrected sodium for hyperglycemia calculator, which is what I would recommend all of you do because I can't remember what it is off the top of my head.
I want to say it's 2. I think it's 2, but don't.
So just for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, remember that your serum osmolality is like sodium, blood urea, nitrogen, and glucose. And so when any of those rise up, you're pulling a ton of water. It becomes essentially hypertonic in the vessels. And so you're pulling a ton of free water into the vasculature. And so when that glucose gets really high, pulls water in. And if it doesn't pull any sodium or anything in with it, the sodium ends up looking low because it's diluted with water, all the water that the glucose pulled in. So if your glucose is super high, your sodium is falsely lowered. So you get a false low on your sodium.
Here's what's interesting about that, though. So I just found it. It is 2.4 millimoles per liter for every 100 milligrams of deciliter of your glucose. So
so glucose goes up by 100, your sodium should go down by 2.5.
Correct. Yeah. 2.
Did I just say that right?
Okay. Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
But it's not, it is, they call it falsely low sodium, but it actually is a low sodium. And I remember reading about this, that the reason they call it a false low sodium is because, or false hyponatremia, is because when you get rid of that sugar, it comes right back. And so they don't want people giving like hypertonic saline to try to bring that up. So it's interesting because there's nothing wrong about that lab value. Like that's their actual sodium, but it's the dynamic flow of the sequence of events that follow. You're giving insulin, it's going to come right back up. But what's cool is you can still calculate your anion gap like you normally do, because if the sodium's diluted, everything else is probably diluted as well. And so you don't get like, oh, I have to correct for the sodium, but I can leave everything else, because typically there's just a global dilutional effect because you're pulling in all that free fluid. So just something to keep in mind on the DKA patient.
Wouldn't that be like horrible if you just added one more level of complexity to DKA patients? Like now you have to think, like you have to correct for everything that's diluted. That would just make things, that would just be the straw that breaks the camel's back, man. Oh no, that's not your real sodium anymore. Oh, God, you got to correct that sodium before you do anything else. So, I see what you're saying. Like, because it's diluted, that's like everything's floating further apart. So that really is pretty much what's available to the cells. Like, and just like the bicarbonate, that should correct on its own once you're kind of replacing water into different places. And yeah, that's a really good point.
It's interesting, like the nomenclature you hear on things sometimes, like, and then understanding like the reason why, because I remember thinking that like, oh, this is a pseudo hyponatremia. And I remember thinking, okay, but if it's diluted, like, why is it actually not a real hyponatremia? Like that seems weird to me that it's a pseudo. Another weird one is when you have a patient that has multiple myeloma and their IGG proteins get elevated, they actually give you a negative anion gap because they increase the unmeasured cations. And so patients with cancer, multiple myeloma, I think it was mostly the IgG or whatever, IgA. But those ones you get I always wanted to see this, like a negative anion gap. I'd be like, what in the world? Because the majority of the anion gap is made up of what? Albumin probably. And then you got a small amount that's lactate.
Phosphate's a big one. Yeah. Albumin, phosphates. There's always a tiny bit of lactate floating around, but that doesn't account for much. Yeah, pretty much. There's some other ones in there. I'm sure you got a tiny bit of like fluoride floating around, maybe. I'm not sure. Yeah, there's some other stuff in there. If you look up like a list of like complete anions, good luck. So, but there's a lot of little ones in there too. But yeah, I'm sure the majority albumin, phosphate, tiny bit of lactate. I would imagine those are the top three. I'm not sure.